Hey everyone, it's Dr. Allie McLean, licensed naturopathic doctor and specialist in gut hormones and mental health. And today I'm going to be talking about stool testing and the different types of stool testing and how to navigate the process of doing a stool test if you are trying to investigate what's going on with your health from the root cause perspective, specifically focusing on the gut. We're going to talk about what a stool test can tell you. We're going to talk about what a stool test can't tell you. We're going to talk about the different types of stool tests, which ones are more useful and which ones we can probably do without. So stay tuned for more. So the first thing I want to talk about is why you would even do a stool test in the first place. Typically, people who are wanting to investigate their health using a functional stool test, they have already gone to their gastroenterologist. And I think this is an important distinction to talk about. If you haven't had a workup with a gastroenterologist and you've had chronic long-standing symptoms, you might want to look into, depending on what your symptoms are, of course, you might want to look into the standard workup of getting a colonoscopy and an endoscopy. Colonoscopy is going to tell you what's going on in that colon, and it will tell you if you have any polyps, precancerous or otherwise. It will tell you if you have inflammation in the colon. There are some different things that can be alluded to in the colon. Sometimes we can see IBD in there. And then an endoscopy can tell us a lot of things. Really, it depends on what it is that we're investigating, but an endoscopy can look at gastritis. Is there inflammation in the stomach? Can look for H. pylori. We can also look at the proximal small intestine, and in some cases you could even find celiac disease depending on the situation, but not always. So if you've gone to your GI doctor and you've done that workup and you're still having GI symptoms and they've kind of written you off as IBS, you have chronic hormonal symptoms, so you have things from heavy periods to breast tenderness. Maybe you even struggle with PMS or PMDD and you heard that there's an estrogen dominance component and you realize that your gut microbiome has a lot to do with estrogen metabolism, or you know that brain inflammation can be caused by gut inflammation, or you're trying to work on detox. So many different reasons why you would do a stool test, or just to investigate why are you not having regular bowel movements or you're having too many bowel movements. All of that falls into the category of why you would get a functional diagnostic stool test. Now, a stool test is not going to tell you everything. It's just going to give you pieces of information that are very useful if you do the right stool test in the right situation, but it's not going to give you all the information. For example, a stool test cannot diagnose anything in the small bowel. So if you have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth or small intestinal methanogen overgrowth, whatever it is, you're not going to be able to see that if you do a stool test. You can see some of the microbes in the large bowel that could be a culprit in the small bowel, but that doesn't mean that they're there present. And in order to do that, you need to do a breath test, which I will do a separate video about. But for a stool test, there's a couple of different things you're looking at. In the stool test that I typically do, we can kind of break it down into different categories. We're looking at the microbiome itself, from the beneficial bacteria to the bacteria that can be, and when I say bacteria, I also mean microorganisms. So it could be fungi, it could be archaea, it could be bacteria, it could be parasites. So we're looking at the normal healthy bugs and we're seeing how much of them are there. The next thing we're looking at are the opportunistic bugs. The opportunistic bugs are just what it sounds like. So given the right circumstances, the right environment, they start to grow and they can start to promote inflammation in our body. And then the third category would be the pathobionts. So the bugs that are more pathogenic, they're very well known to create systemic inflammation via, for example, lipopolysaccharide or bacterial endotoxin. So those are the bugs that we're looking at. And we could categorize that as, bacteria, fungi, parasites, archaea. So that's what, from a microbiome perspective, a stool test at least should be looking at, a good stool test. Then there's the other side of a stool test, which are stool chemistries. So stool chemistries tell us about a lot of different things. It's kind of like when you do a blood test and you get a complete blood count or you get a complete metabolic panel. It's a very basic overview, but you can get a lot of information out of it. So a complete blood count is going to look at your red blood cells, your white blood cells. It's going to point to if you have anemia, if you potentially have a bacterial or viral or parasitic infection. A metabolic panel is going to look at liver and kidney function. It's going to look at fasting glucose. So it's kind of like a good broad snapshot and overview. So what a stool test will tell you with a stool chemistries is it can tell you markers of inflammation. So that can look like something called fecal calprotectin or fecal lactoferrin, which those tend to be elevated when you have cases of IBD or sometimes post-infectious situations in the gut, like a gastroenteritis. You can also see cold blood in the stool, so that's a really important one to look for. If you have blood in the stool, then we would want to further investigate a GI bleed. You can also get an idea of what the stool pH is, which is very important when it comes to microbial health in your colon. You can also see short chain fatty acids, so how much butyrate, acetate, and propionate you have, which are also going to be super important for the health of your colonocytes, the cells in your colon, as well as metabolic health. You can also see markers of maldigestion, so steatocrit, which means fat in your stool. So if you're malabsorbing fat in the small intestine, that will come to the large intestine and you will see it in your stool. We can also see ammonia and branched chain amino acids in the stool, and that will indicate, again, malabsorption, or unconjugated bile acids, same thing, bile acid malabsorption. So some of the stuff you see in the stool can point to an issue upstream in the small intestine, which is really helpful information, but then you would want to go and further investigate that in the small intestine. You can also see secretory IgA, which is an indication of mucosal immunity. So you can see if your immune system is either under or over responding to something in your gut. Could really be anything, could be food, could be pathogens. And finally, you can see your pancreatic enzyme output. So stool elastase is a good indicator for pancreatic exocrine insufficiency. So those are the things that you can see on a stool test. Now let's talk about what different kinds of stool tests are available, because they are not all made the same. And I'm going to start with the GI map, because the GI map is by far the most popular stool test in the functional medicine space for reasons unbeknownst to me, other than just it being a trend. The problem with the GI map is that it's a PCR test. A PCR test is going to show you what you're looking for. A PCR test is a pathogen detection test, essentially. So it will tell you if you have something there, but it leaves out so much information. Other examples of PCR tests are Genova GI effects and also doctor's data, the comprehensive stool diagnostic analysis, I believe it's called. They also do some culturing as well, which is more of an old school technique. They do that for susceptibility to different herbal and pharmaceutical antimicrobials. As far as I understand, there's not a PCR test that looks for the organism Bilophila wadsworthia, which is a really common organism that is a hydrogen sulfide producing proteobacteria. So this one can create more inflammation in the colon via the production of hydrogen sulfide gas, and it's very common because it likes to eat bile, which is in its name, and bile is something that is produced a lot when people eat a more high-fat diet, higher in saturated fat in particular, and the standard American diet tends to be higher in saturated fat. If you're eating animal protein, it's a really important one to keep your eye on. So the PCR tests don't look for this organism. They also don't have specificity down to the strain level. They just have specificity down to the species level. And they're just looking at species that they have chosen and decided to look at. So it's not sequencing your entire microbiome. It's not fragmenting and putting the pieces together and trying to paint a picture out of it like the other tests, which I will talk about, do. It's just looking at the little things that it decides to look at, which is not in the context of the greater microbiome. We are an ecosystem. Our gut is an ecosystem. It's like the macrocosm of the outside world, and all of the bugs and the critters that exist out there, that exists within our gut as well. Our gut is not in a vacuum. So doing a pathogen detection test, the problem with that is that if you have a hammer, everything will look like a nail. If you go to a surgeon, they're going to recommend surgery. If you do a pathogen detection test, then your practitioner who runs this test for you is going to be like, oh, looks like we need to do some pathogen eradication. And there's going to be a lot of focus on that and little focus on the other important aspects of the gut. My other gripe with these PCR tests is that oftentimes they're being done out of context. So they're the only test that is being done to investigate what's going on as far as gut health, which is incredibly, in my opinion, irresponsible, because how are we going to know that the few things that were indicated on this PCR test are actually what's causing your GI symptoms if we haven't done any investigation into the small intestine, we haven't looked at intestinal permeability, we haven't really tested the probiotic bugs in your gut accurately. There's so many pieces of the puzzle that are missing to make an accurate diagnosis. And what happens is people wind up going down this rabbit hole of chasing a pathogen. Like it's all H. pylori, it's all this. And those things are important, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes we can see blastocystis hominis and people hyper-focus on blastocystis hominis thinking that that is the cause of their symptoms, but the whole time they have had SIBO, but they've been so focused on treating the blastocystis, antibiotic cocktail after antibiotic cocktail, or even really harsh herbs that harm the microbiome, and then years later they're still with the same symptoms, or maybe they're even worse because a proper diagnostic workup hasn't been done. That's a conversation for another time. So let's get into the other two types of tests. Now, these two tests are more along the lines of what would be done in microbiota research. So we have what's called a shotgun sequencing test, and we have something called a 16S RNA test. So 16S RNA sequencing, what is it? Basically, all bacteria and all archaea, which is another type of microorganism, produce something or contain something called 16S RNA. And so whenever you run this test, you're able to see the bacteria and the archaea present because they contain that 16S RNA. So it's pulling from that. And then it's compared to a database. So the database already has the specific type of 16S RNA in each individual organism. It's not as specific to the species level, it's more specific to the genus level, but it still gives you good information, and it gives you a wider, broader view of the microbiome versus just whatever you're testing for in a PCR test. The downfalls of a 16S RNA test are that you can't look at fungi, you can't look at parasites. One example of 16S RNA testing is BiomeSite, which is one that I've used pretty frequently, and it gives you a pretty good overview. Finally, we have what's called a shotgun sequencing test. So shotgun sequencing is by far the most advanced technique that gives you the best information in terms of a comprehensive view of the microbiome, looking at pathogens, looking at parasites, looking at archaea, looking at bacteria, looking at fungi, looking at all the things. What it does is it takes the DNA from the sample and it fragments it, and then it tries to put it in a picture that makes sense, that's representative of the entire microbiome. So one of the cool things about a shotgun sequencing test is you can actually see the genes that the bacteria encode that are involved in different metabolic processes in the body. For example, fiber breakdown or ammonia production. It will be able to tell you which of those microbes is doing that. Another cool thing is that it will identify the organisms in the microbiota that might not have been categorized or well categorized yet, or we don't exactly know what they do, but it will still pick up on them. So it's kind of the opposite of a PCR test, where it's like PCR test is just looking for what we know to look for in a very narrow window. This gives us very comprehensive information down to the species and the strain level, and it can tell us the genes that these bacteria are encoding. and much more. So the company that I use for this test is a company called Tiny Health. I use Tiny Health Pro because it has the stool chemistries and it also has the shotgun sequencing. So it provides a very comprehensive view of the colon. And really, it's the only information that I need from the standpoint of assessing the health of the colon, aside from going to the gastroenterologist if it is indicated, getting a colonoscopy. But this test will give you pretty much all the information you need to know. So that's why I go with that one. I hope this video provided some clarity into stool testing for you. If you liked it, please like the video and subscribe, and I will continue to make more informative videos from my lens of health as a naturopathic doctor. Thank you.